自月他他米中那南中木着定三米左那南左土也西之所同我出着对吧西当海着米居中他他天着都自节那么他么爱他们心结了谁当所谓的不了就当米色东北其实上了他那年年经安节对所谁些那么人不节对节就把节去浪节破坏给都被定谁些不是节当的法子着个把自别他的所三节了张所的把他们那外就的他把让真的把跑把节的完全你我日别的年纪都所谓的所突节怎么是木着节三个节个节自把没把没给的我的那边起来真大这往左边三节他把过送给咱那些把他们心节的都他他你都在我前边谢谢新年这我都节大家特别浪漫去在天上大不一年新年来些。浪漫他把拉苏万的所记在两把同来情节老师，记所怎么情节老师，土也几个两把情节，结完的结完自然的自然，他们这都不点浪漫，他把这边结完他们这完情节老师，没这边结完他把他们这都没这完情节老师，结完的结完自然的自然，他们这都不点浪漫了，今年去年也告诉我。往天老婆多连没不来情节老师，多个节目送到去姐姐，这他去不来情节老师，您老这把东北人也不来情节老师，你不来去玩你呢，这把他没见那么去老去玩的，先老他说请别给。没见过别见嘛就这些，叫我工作把点干嘛吧，没见多见那么的见呢，三万多见的把那没见，接着那见送着工作上，叫我工作用钱当把就上那这边怎么可能当一当年把点的话，后来都别接着在这些，那见你把每个家家见，现在我把点那没个送着多见上一个把。那这天嘛，就多上一些，我玩的那心间当姐姐，主持到所心间当姐姐，给所别把的知道我把的上给你把要菜，这当吃了工作没人说。娘们当不可觉了，所玩的所没觉的所见把了，所玩的所主角干嘛看上了，所玩的所杜姐姐那就不见了，所玩的所你把见上见你把了，所玩的所前浪见他也要见了，所玩的所其实都见要见了，所玩的所从面都见搞完了，所玩的所当面要见上坡了，所玩的所正面没见上坡了，所玩的所。学了从面了，所玩的所土姐从面了，所玩的所牛把从面了，所玩的所去玩一年走了情节老师，去把今年都不来情节，即将见面都不来情节老师，没到年些就来情节老师，年年没别土姐见了，所玩的所去了没别情来见了，所玩的所马去没别见了见了，所玩的所同对等等见在把见了，所玩的。所叫我去大家做了所谓的所不见没见都见了所谓的所叫我不觉也了所谓的所就在我觉都见了所谓的所看我去见我就了所谓的所叫这去也都见了所谓的所把的一些宁波了所谓的所从没一些都见了所谓的所把见去见跟着了所谓的所叫我想去都见了所谓的所谁都去见。中年了所谓的所，就算都见了所谓的所，别帮去这家做了所谓的所，别骂你见忘过了所谓的所，叫我对这都见了所谓的所，就算老这他也了所谓的所，公司发家都见了所谓的所，别骂我去见过了所谓的所，把年轻在我生了所谓的所，让穷人别都见了所谓的所，今天早也浪漫了所谓的所。现在这边讲完了所谓的所，让将新年到过了所谓的所，三月的话连的完了所 Sawadi So She Chavadi Ne Chava Tuja Maya Sudip So Chava Tana Tuje Jine So Chibe Nanam Doli Je Nisungi Chigu Tama June Tara Namcho Dewa Chinje Shingam No Jizin Duje Yangje Dini Papa Jire Se Wanchu Shinda Visreji Cha Rimbro Jami Kiji Lapa Kyangkum Samla Jimba Shaji Shiba Inu Meji Be Uchimbo Jimbe Chiji Tobo Jela Soa Deso Meji Be Uchimbo Jimbe Chiji Tobo Jela Soa Deso Meji Be Uchimbo Jimbe Chiji Tobo Jela Soa Deso Chiji Jewa Tani Tongje Nori Sala Sama Yame Bala Nije Chiji Lama Lake Pade Lame Namze Lane Sho Pade Lame Nambra Tawala Kichi Samya Loka Mije Chize Lebra Tongwe Mige Lame Jila Semba Jubra Sho Jewa Kundo Yanta Lama Chame Chiji Pala Long Chiji Sada Lamye Yenzera Doje Change Goba Nyo Doi Sho Neji Zo Pede Dede Na Semba Rangjung Doje La Kajwe Lame Soje Goda Mige Dongwe Sawande Nase Jinje La Tose Umi Jo Doje Dede Na Chumne Tuje Chimbola Jawa Jaso Soje Goda Mige Dongwe Sawande Nase Jinje La Tose Yeme Bombarwe Longe Na Choe Jabo Tachola Pawe Jaso Soje Goda Mige Dongwe Sawande Nase Jinje La Tose Yonkaje Tabe Shaye Na Yun Sawa Yishe Ta Gila Kandre Jaso Soje Goda Mige Dongwe Sawande Nase Jinje La Tose Tenta Bala Yishe Na Lobe Pema Chumne La Chukto Jaso Soje Goda Mige Dongwe Sawande Nase Jinje La Tose Odam Se Chimbo Shaye Na Chujang Mage Chamdra La Tamje Jaso Soje Goda Mige Dongwe Sawande Nase Jinje La Tose Sawa Chibra Jinam La Teje Gebe Soda Be Tata Jojo Simje Na Namba Kunje Toba Shu Semba Rangju Doje Ne Ishe Nambo Nyeba Na Tashe Yonje Uwa Se Bade Jumwe Tashe Jo Changju Simje Chile Je Tuje Wese Chojo Jo Jama Na Nyanye Da Zamne Dewe Tashe Jo Zale Ne Wanze Lo So
We will begin with the opening prayers.
Nam
First of all, I would like to offer you all my warm greetings, and in particular, according to the Tsurpo tradition of astrological calculations, today is the New Year day, and so I'd like to wish you that all of you in this new year, that everything's auspicious, that you accomplish all your aims, that everything goes excellently for all of you. Now, the other day, I thought I should say something in Chinese, but I've completely forgot to, so I'll see if a few words can come out.
前几天我应该要跟大家用中文来祝贺大家新年快乐，但是呢，我那时候就是脑子不转，所以呢，就没想到自己会说中文，所以，今天就借这个机会，今天大年初二，所以呢，借这个机会呢。 希望大家在新的一年里身体健康然后一切顺利然后功德圆满，谢谢。라서 다드네 다드린 것을 봐봐들이야.
So today we will speak about the spread of the mind only in Tibet, won't we? That's what I will speak about today. Now, it's a bit difficult to speak about how the mind only spread to the snowland of Tibet. And the reason is that I have not really seen any research by anyone researching how the mind only spread to Tibet. And so in order to create sort of an overview of this, I had to look at many different texts and look through many sources. And it is very difficult to do this in a really good and reliable, correct way in a short period of time, but I'm doing as much as I can to explain this as clearly as possible. So in general, in Tibet, if we talk about how the spread only, how mind only spread, I think it's actually maybe better to speak about it in terms of how the text of the mind only spread. Because the mind only school itself did not spread, I think it's actually difficult to explain how the mind only spread. But if we talk about it in terms of how the mind only texts spread to Tibet, I think that is a more fruitful way of looking at the situation. In terms of how the text spread into Tibet, there are 5 different topics that I'd like to discuss today. Now, the first is how the mind-only texts were translated in Tibetan. Then the second is the reasons why the mind-only school itself did not spread to Tibet. The third is the question of whether the reasons why Vasubandu and Asanga are mind-only masters. And the fourth is why the mind-only school, or the different explanations in Tibet of the mind-only. And the fifth is whether the Maitreya, Dharmas of Maitreya, and so forth. So I will. It'll be difficult to cover all of these today, and so I'll explain what I can today. And then the day after, tomorrow is the day off, and then the day after that, I'll describe what I have not gone through, and then speak about other points. Now, as you all know, the texts of the mind-only school have spread into Tibet, and in terms of the descriptions of the positions of the mind-only school, there has been continuous study and research into them from the ancient times till the present. However, in Tibet, from the time that Buddhism spread to Tibet until the present, no independent mind-only school has ever really appeared. And in the very least, it's doubtful that there is even one Tibetan master who asserted that the mind only was their own positions. In particular, in the period of later transmission, Chandrakirti's consequentialist school spread widely, and because of its influence or because of the imprint that it made, people have thought of the mind only as the opponents and as a school that it is not concordant with the middle way. So this idea has been so strong that there have been few who have taken any responsibility or interest in finding out what the mind-only's positions in their own support, and whether scriptural or logical, are. There are fewer and fewer who have had any interest in this. Particularly when we think about the mind only seems to be the mind only. It seems like we think that it is just as the way as it appears in the to the middle way, and we think that's how the mind is. And this is a rather dictatorial way of looking at it, actually. So it seems actually as if the Tibetans have not really treated the mind only completely fairly. That's how I see it. For example, when I see that as how in debates in Tibetan schools, we really insist on pointing out others' points as much as we can. And even if the same faults apply to oneself, we pretend that they don't. And we take this kind of, we are audacious enough to think this, or we are really insistent. So we see many such situations, right? When we are debating with each other. And I think that it's similar. We treat the mind only in a similar fashion. And so for this reason, if we want a study of philosophy such as the mind only well, we need to dispose of the conceit of thinking of ourselves as being mind only. And we need to feel like have an affinity for the mind only. And we need to have an impartial position where we think that perhaps the middle way objections to the middle way apply, and perhaps they don't. And if we can study with an impartial position, then we'll be able to understand the mind only more completely and better. And so that's how I see it. Now, the first section discussing the translation of the mind-only literature into Tibetan. This is the first section of our talk about how the mind-only spread to Tibet. And so now, when we look at the text of the Tibetan Kanjur and Tanjur, most of the texts in the sutra sections were translated during the time of the ancient transmission. And thus, most of the important mind-only texts were already translated during the time of the ancient transmission. Likewise, if we look at the histories we still have, at that time, the main school that spread in Tibet was the mind-only school, or it was the middle way school. But when we look at the ancient catalogs, we see that the mind-only middle way texts were given equal importance and translated. This is very clearly visible in the catalogs. So for this reason, so when we talk about the situation or the period of translating mind-only texts in Tibetan, we can distinguish two different periods. And these are those translated during the ancient transmission and those translated during the later transmission. So there are these two points. And so if you talk about those translated during the ancient transmission, so what was translated during that time, our knowledge primarily comes from three ancient catalogs. So the three ancient catalogs of the ancient transition. So what these three catalogs are, there's the Pantangma catalog, Denkarma catalog, and the Chimpuma catalog. These are the three catalogs. And of them, the Chimpuma is no longer extant. But the Pantangma and the Denkarma are. Bhutan Rinpoche, Pao Tsulak Trengma, and others say that the Denkarma catalog was earlier, but the fifth Dalai Lama, Siddha June, and others say that the Pantangma catalog was earlier. And so they do have these differing explanations. But if we look at it, there are more works listed in the Denkarma than in the Pantangma. So it seems that the Denkarma may have been later in this regard. But in the Pantangma, there are descriptions of events from the time during the reign of Tridapa Chen. So it seems that the earlier Pantangma catalog may have been edited later. So it's possible that one could explain it this way. Alternatively, some modern scholars say that these catalogs were lists of the texts that were kept in individual palaces. They were not prepared as catalogs of all the sutras and treatises that had been translated into Tibetan. So that is also said, but in any case, the ones that are listed in the Pantangma are also included in the Denkarma. But there are many that are in the Denkarma that are not included in the Pantangma. Now, if we compare these, look at their sources and compare them in detail, in the Pantangma catalog, there are really no more than the root text and a couple of commentaries of the mind only. There's primarily the root text and just one or two commentaries. Whereas in the Denkarma, there are many commentaries that are not listed, that are listed in the Denkarma that are not listed in the Pantangma. And so what we can tell from this is that at the beginning, the Tibetan translators translated the most important mind-only texts and a few important commentaries. And then later, they translated as many important commentaries as they were able. And so this is the what becomes clear from looking at these. So in brief, most of the important mind-only texts had already been translated during the ancient transmission. And so there are not as many mind-only texts translated during the later transmission as there had been during the ancient transmission. So what was translated during the later transmission is primarily the works written by Indian mind-only masters who appeared after the ancient transmission was translated. So among the most important of them are the works of Shantipa. Shantipa was among all the later Indian mind-only masters, the one living at the time of the beginning of the later transition was Shantipa. And so his works, many of his works are translated into Tibetan during the later transmission. Now, in particular, the well-known treatise, The Sublime Continuum, was first translated into Tibetan during the later transition period. And the commentaries on the Sublime Continuum and the Distinguished Phenomena and Dharmata were written by Asanga were translated during the later transition period.
대신도 바치들 더동 부된 탐색계획이 땡큐 가샤 나노리아 제비입니다.
So the presentation of the five dharmas of Maitreya must have originated during the time of the later transmission. Moreover, if we look at Bhutan's catalog of the Tenjur, the most important mind-only texts that had not been translated in the ancient translation but were translated in the later translation are the main commentaries. The commentaries on the Ornament of the Sutras, the Compendium of Mahayana, and the Compendium of Abhidharma. So, to sum it up, when we compare the catalogs of the mind-only works translated during the ancient translation and the catalog of the later transmission, the Sunlight of the Ornament of the Teachings by Chondan Rikral, and Bhutan's catalog of the Tenjur, and so when we compare, then the later catalog of the Derje Tenjur, you can see that all of the mind-only text works translated in Tibetan were probably almost all translated before the time of Bhutan. Now, the reason for saying this is that, for example, there's the Derje Tenjur, which is like the latest and most complete edition of the Kanjur and the Tenjur. And so it is the most complete, they're like recognized as the final edition of the Tenjur, the most complete. And there's basically no mind-only text in it that is not included in Bhutan Rinpoche's catalog. And so if we total all of the mind-only works and works by mind-only scholars translated into Tibetan, there are the Dharmas of Maitreya by the protector Maitreya, which teach either the mind-only, their middle way view. That's one section. The works of Asanga and Vasubandu that teach Mahamandali philosophy. And then there are the works on validity by Dignaga and Dharmakirti and others that do not teach mind-only philosophy at length, but his ultimate view is mind-only, as they're written by mind-only masters. So they have these are the texts on validity have a very great connection to the mind-only. And then there are also texts on the secret mantra by mind-only scholars such as Bhavabhadra and Shantipa. And likewise, there are the commentaries on sutras by Vasubandu, Stiramati, and other masters. So in terms of their content, there are 5 or 6 different sections If we discriminate them and divide them and classify them by their different contexts, there are five or six different sections of these. Now, if we take the text of validity and secret mantra out of these, then the others can be divided into three categories. Now, that is how Buddha Rinpoche divided his catalog. And what these three sections are: those that teach the mind-only view, those that teach mind-only meditation, those that primarily teach conduct and precepts. And so within these, like the five dharmas of Maitreya, the Yogacara levels, and the eight treatises, the eight prakarana, are works that teach the mind-only view. Asanga's lamp of the dhyana, Tikanaga's introduction to yoga, and so forth, are works that teach meditation. Chandragomi's 20 vows and so forth are works that primarily determine conduct. And so in this way, he divided it into three different sections. Now, of course, there is a lot of debate in Tibet as to whether the ornament of the sutras is a mind-only text or not. But in the catalog of the Tenjura, all of the dharmas of Maitreya are included in the section on the mind only. They're rare. They're never really put in the section on the middle way. And so when we look at the catalogs of the Tenjura, the Maitreya, it is generally said in unison in Tibet that all of the dharmas of Maitreya are mind only and not middle way texts. And so this tradition was probably probably originated from Buddha Rinpoche. Alternatively, it's possible that it had also been determined earlier. That, of course, is possible. Now, in terms of the Deje Tenjura, there are 16 volumes from the volume P to the volume He. And in them, the commentaries on the Sublime Continuum and its the Sublime Continuum and its commentary by Sangha are included in that section. Now, there are some commentaries on sutras that are not included in those. They're in a different section because of the different section for sutra commentaries. This includes the commentaries on the Sutra Unraveling the Intent, the Sutra of the 10 Levels, and the Vajra Splitter. And so these are in the section of the sutra, in the section of sutra commentaries. And these are mainly commentaries that are either mind-only or written by mind-only masters. And the new translations included in the Diganaga, they're the summary of the 8,000 lines by Diganaga and Venerasambhava's Strings of Light and so forth. There are many such texts. And so that is a brief introduction of the translation of mind-only texts into Tibetan. So now the second section is the reasons why the actual mind-only philosophy did not spread in Tibet. So as I have explained, the texts of the mind-only philosophy, were they interested in Tibet? They were. Many were translated. However, did an independent school holding that view spread or not? For the ancient transition period, it's difficult to say categorically whether there was or was not. But it seems that in the later transmission, there was none. Well, then in Tibet, both the vehicles of cause and result spread so widely. So what is the reason why both Mahayana schools did not completely flourish in Tibet? What is the point that this comes down to? And I think if you ask it, I think that there are several different reasons. Now, these are my own opinions that I've written down. Whether it's logical or not is a different matter. Now, so there are a few reasons, and I think that among these conditions, the first is that I'd bring up four reasons. The first of these, the first reason why the mind only did not spread to Tibet is that it did not spread because of the edict of the Dharma kings. Now, if you think of that, it did not spread because of the edict of the Dharma king. The meaning of this is that there are Tibetan histories such as the Ba She, which is an old ancient history of Tibet. And what it says in many of those times is that in the 8th century, there was the Tunzen debate. There were debates between the Tunming and the Zenming. Now, these are Chinese terms, and this means the proponents of the Southern Awakening versus the proponents of the gradual path. And the people who made this debate were Kamala Shila, was the main of the gradual path, and Hashamayana and so forth are the proponents of the sudden awakening. And after this debate says that made the edict that from that point on one must follow the tradition of Nagarjuna. So he made this edict, made a new law. So for that reason, only the view of Nagarjuna tradition flourished in Tibet, and the mind-only tradition did not. And so this is what is commonly explained in Tibet. Now, if that is a true event, if that edict is the truth, then the main reason why the mind-only did not spread in Tibet is because of the king's edict, and there's no need to mention that. However, but if we look at a text found in Dunhuang called the Mahayana Instructions on Realizing the Nature Instantly, what this says is that there is this debate between the proponents of sudden awakening and the gradualists. And so during the debate, what happened? The proponents of sudden awakening actually win. And at that point, the king gave the world that made the edict that the sudden awakening tradition is a worthy tradition and that everyone may practice. And this was very clearly written. And this text was written by a student of Hashamayana from that very time. This is a history from that time. Similarly, if we look at Nupsangi Yeshe's Lamp of the Eye of Dhyana, the Zen tradition was not only not missing in Tibet, but they're still present at the time of the Emperor Langdharma. So if we look at the texts from the time of the ancient tradition, there are many from the Tibetan Zen tradition, and so there are still grounds to question whether the king made such an edict or not. You can't categorically say that he made such a. I think it's difficult to say categorically that he made such an edict. So that's the first reason. Now, the second reason is that most of the Indian scholars who went to Tibet were middle way scholars, not mind only. And so it didn't spread for that reason. Now, the time when these initially spread most rapidly in Tibet was during the time of King Jisung Detsen, edict or not. Now, before that, you can't categorically say that he made such a Dharma first spread into Tibet. And of course, there are many different accounts. But if we look at the pillars at Samye and other reliable texts, it was during the time of Trisung Getsen, kind of Sonsen Gampo, that Dharma began to spread to Tibet. However, when you actually look at when the true Dharma spread with a great strength in Tibet, then this, if we look at the ancient history, was during the time of Trisung Detsen. And the most famous scholar invited to bring the Dharma to Tibet was Shantarakshita. And so what school did he follow? He was an autonomous middle way master. And most of the Indian scholars who came later than Shantarakshita, such as Kamala Shila, were also middle way masters. They were all middle way masters. And there was probably no mind-only master who came to Tibet. And so for this reason, there was no one to guide or encourage them. And so this is another reason why the mind-only school did not spread into Tibet. Now, the third reason is that people didn't see a particular reason or purpose for studying the mind-only philosophy, and therefore it did not spread. Now, what this means is, the reason why they didn't see a reason to study the mind only is because of the influence of Shantarakshita and so forth. During the time period of the ancient tradition, it was mainly the middle way, autonomous middle way that spread. And so it's the middle way, and it was the autonomous middle way, and within the autonomous middle way is primarily the Yogacara autonomous middle way. In our Tenjura, there is a text called The Distinctions of the View by the great Tibetan translator Yeshide. It's based on Asanga's Yogacarya treatise explaining the awareness only. The Kempo named Shantarakshita wrote the middle way treatise, the ornament of the middle way, that proves in harmony with that tradition that relatively there is consciousness only. But ultimately, consciousness too has no nature. And so it is very clear. So for that reason, the autonomous middle way school unites the mind-only middle way view. So it treats the conventional according to the mind-only and the ultimate according to the middle way. So it unites the mind-only and middle way. So if we look at this as for this reason, if we study the autonomous middle of the Yogacara autonomous school, then seems like there's no reason to study the mind-only tradition separately, because they explain the Yogacara autonomous school explains the conventional presentation according to the mind only, and the ultimate nature is taught according to the middle way. And so people think that it's this way, or so it seems possible that people would think like this. Likewise, since it teaches that the ultimate nature is the middle way, it is teaching that the mind-only view is not the final view. And so for this reason, Tibetans like high views in schools. They naturally like high views in high schools and so forth. They really didn't have much enthusiasm for specifically studying mind-only philosophy. So that is in terms of the ancient transition. Now, in terms of the later transmission, now the most influential Indian master to come to Tibet during that time was Lord Atisha. Now, Lord Atisha had, according to traditional account, was said to praise the consequentialist middle view of Chandrakirti very, very highly. So this is the generally accepted account. Later, among the later Kadampa masters, the one who had the most master was Shangsharawa. And he supported Patsao Lotsawa, Patsao translator, and translating Chandrakirti as entering the middle way, and it's an auto-commentary. And these texts include so many refutations of the mind only and all that. And likewise, also, after Chandrakirti's works had been translated into Tibetan, all the Tibetan traditions suddenly hurried to become consequentialists. So they held Chandrakirti's words to be authoritative. And because of that, the mind-only view was viewed in an even worse way than it had been before. It was considered to be a bad tradition. Not only was it not the ultimate view, it was a mistaken view, so it was seen in that way. And so there was basically no interest in the mind-only view. Now, the fourth reason was that even though the teaching and study of the Dharmas and Maitreya's did flourish, but this is in terms of them being written by Maitreya, not because they had mind-only philosophy. Now, generally, Tibetans had a great motivation to study the Dharmas of Maitreya. But having the motivation to study the Dharmas of Maitreya did not really help the mind-only philosophy spread. In fact, it was not only that it didn't help the mind-only philosophy spread, it was actually the opposite. Because it is difficult to say that there's anything illogical in the works of someone such as the Rijna Maitreya. They did everything they could to explain the dharmas of Maitreya or Maitreya's thought as being middle way. Now, so in general, the thought of the dharmas of Maitreya is very profound. And it like wraps up many features of the mind only, and so it wraps them together, and they're not terribly clear. So it's actually relatively easy to explain them a way that matches the thought of the middle way. And so people take it for granted that the view of the text of mind only, that the types of Maitreya were mind only, were middle way. They say, they said it's consequentialist, or you say that it's a Shentong middle way. And it's not all that difficult to do so. So in brief, for these reasons, these are, if we look at the actual reasons why the mind only did not spread in Tibet, I think that if we wrap it up, they're basically these 4 reasons. Now, the third reason is the reasons for Sangha and Vasubandu and so forth being mind-only masters. Now, of course, in Tibet in later times, there's been a lot of debate over whether the ideas or view or thought of the Sangha, Vasubandu, and so forth is mind-only philosophy or not. Some say it is, some say it is not. Now, another distinction that is made in Tibet is the distinction. There's a tradition of distinguishing between the thought of the author and the thought of the treatise. It's a question of whether it is possible that some treatises have the same thought as the master, the authors of the teachers, or that they might have reasons for writing treatises that have a slightly different thought. And so that there's the thought, there's the idea that they can explain for various reasons. They can explain one treatise according to the thought of a different treatise because of a different school. But there's basically some debate as to whether Asangha, Vasubandu, and so forth are mind-only philosophy or not. But I think that I think we need to understand the reasons why their thought is mind-only. It is important for us to understand both sides. Those who say that the mind-only school is not, or that the Asangha and Vasubandu are not mind-only, we need to understand the reasons. But there are also reasons why people say that they are mind-only. We need to understand this. If we say that I'm not going to look at the reason, I'm not going to listen, I'm not going to hear it, and close our eyes to it, then we're not being impartial in evaluating their view. And so for that reason, so I think that it is difficult to say whether Sangha and Vasubandu are mind-only or not, but I think there are reasons why their thought would be mind-only, or at least in accord with mind-only. The first is that it was known to be so in India. When Bhaviviveka and Chandrakirti refuted the mind-only school, they quote from the works of Asangha and Vasubandhu and so forth to refute them. Likewise, Bhaviviveka mentions Asangha and Vasubandhu by name. Chandrakirti, in his auto-commentary on the Entering the Middle Way, also mentions the names of Vasubandhu, Dignaga, Dharmapala, and so forth by name, saying that they had not realized the Nagarjuna's view. And so for this reason, it is recognized among Indian masters that it was generally recognized among Indian masters that Vasubandhu and Asangha were mind-only masters. The second reason is that they were known to be so in China. As I mentioned the other day, Tang Xuanzang and others went to India and they bowed their feet at the students of Vasubandhu's lineage. And they studied this mind-only philosophy. And so in the lineage of gurus, they recognized that they're in the same school to be mind-only. So they took this, they accepted this, and they brought it back to China and propagated the mind-only view. And so I think this is a fairly clear reason. Now, the third reason when we look at the catalogs of the Pantangman Denkarma from the time of the Tibetan emperor, the treatises on the mind only and conscious were divided into separate sections. So in the oldest ancient catalogs of the text, the Pantangman Denkarma, there are separate sections for mind only and conscious. And so the teaching the treatises of Maitreya, the Yogacara levels, and the works of Asanga, Vasubandu, and so forth are included in the consciousness or mind-only section, not in the middle way section. So this is an important point, I think. Now, the fourth reason is that if we look at the results, contemporary researchers are generally in agreement that that Asanga and Vasubandhu's texts are mind only. So basically, there's no dispute among international researchers that their works are mind only. So if we want to understand Asanga and Vasubandhu's works, what we first have to understand is if we want to have a good understanding of mind only philosophy, we first need to identify what the mind only texts were. And once we have identified those, we need to accept them as being mind-only texts. And once we've recognized that, we need to accept it. And once we want to accept that, then we see them as proponents of the mind only. If instead of that, we think that it's going to harm our position as our own position of our own positions, and we insist and explain them however we want, saying, "Oh, this is mind only, this is middle way," then there wouldn't be much benefit. There's not much point. Now, generally, no matter what explanation you give is up to you. But from one perspective, if you make any explanation at all, then there's not much benefit in gaining the understanding of the thought of the masters of the path. Now, from a second perspective, our own assertions are our own individual opinions, and they're difficult for other scholars and other schools to accept. And so people say, that's your opinion, fine. You may have your own opinions, but if you want other schools to accept it, then it's difficult. So in terms of other schools and other scholars, it's difficult to accept them. And another point is that it may well be contradictory of factual history. We make up our own opinion. No, it may look really nice, but if we look at the history of the past, and we look back at that and research it, and our positions in the actual history don't match, then there's a big problem there. So that's another point. Now, the fourth section is the explanations of the mind only in Tibet. So you might wonder, well, was there no discussion of mind only in philosophy at all in Tibet? Did no one ever talk about mind only? No one says that. In Tibet, it's generally said that there are four schools: the Great Exposition, Sutra School, Mind Only, and Middle Way schools. And this term of the four schools, and now these terms, whether these terms were available or were found in India or so forth, we immediately give citations saying there must have been. Of course there were. From the Bodhisattva Dorje Nyingtik's commentary, and say that there are only four philosophical schools. A fifth is not the victor's intent. And also away from Gyanagarbha's compendium, it is said. So there are many who give these explanations. Likewise, we also say that it's talked in the two books of Hevajra Tantra. Now, other schools say that, other researchers say that now, first of all, we have to look at whether these are actually in the text. We have to look at when text appears. And so there is a danger that they'll say that actually this discussion did not appear earlier, so it's only made up later. But in any case, in Tibet, we say that there are the four schools: the Great Exposition, Sutra, Mind Only, and Middle Way. Now, for the first three of these, there was no independent school of the first three in Tibet. But in terms of what their views and thought were, from ancient times to today, you say, has there been any discussion of teaching of that? There has been, of course. In particular, before one studies the great texts, which is the four great texts, there's a tradition of studying the topic of the philosophical schools separately. And what's taught in the topic of the philosophical schools is the assertions of the ground, path, and fruition of the four schools. And these are taught in general terms. And particularly when studying the texts like the Ornament of Clear Realization, other texts on Prajnaparamita, then in the context of distinguishing the expedient definitive, one studies the mind only and the middle way, explanations in great detail. In the context of teachings on validity, the discussion of valid means, its result in the known object, has a great connection to the mind only. So many points that are related to the mind only come up in this context. Likewise, in entering the middle way, the main opponent is the mind only. So there's a lot of research and discussion of the points related to that. Also, as in the mind only, one must know the difference between the Foundation and Mahayana Abhidharma schools and the differences in their lists and enumerations. So basically, in the five great texts, other than in the Vinaya, there are many passages that are related to the mind only. And so therefore, Tibetan Buddhist scholars have to give their own explanations of them and made unending refutation explanations. So it is not at all the case that Tibetan scholars had no knowledge of the mind only, or did no research into the mind only, or held no discussion of the mind only. We cannot say that at all. Likewise, each scholar had its own way of explaining the mind only. There are many different ways. To give some examples, generally later in Tibet, we've got in Tibet, instead of using the terms Yogacara and the proponents of awareness, it's more widely called the mind-only school. And I can't explain exactly why this. Perhaps what it is, I can't say this for certain, but I think that in the middle way texts, the term mind only is used more often than awareness only. But in the ancient transition, the terms proponents of consciousness and proponents of awareness were more frequent. There's a text on the philosophical schools by Upalosya. And what it says is, those who won't explain the known objects are internal, or whose Abhidharma scriptures follow the Yogacara levels are called Yogacara mind only. In any case, in Tibet, when you talk about who was the founder of the mind only, there are three main assertions. So they're basically the three different main assertions. And the first is one, the founders were earlier masters. The second is that it was founded by the protector Maitreya. And the third is that they're founded primarily by Asanga and Vasubandu. So these are the three main positions. Now, the assertion that the mind only was founded by earlier masters is from Jonan Taranata in primary. So in Taranati's History of Dharma India, he writes that when the Mahayana first spread in India, mind only spread. And among the masters, there's primarily the Venerable Dampite and Paramartha. And so these held and propagated the mind-only tradition, he says. And then Taksan Lotsawa and others assert that the mind only was founded by Maitreya. Lord Tsongkhapa and most other explanations explain that the founder of the mind only was Asanga. Now, there are a few who say that it was Asanga and Vasubandhu. And so in this respect, the Tibetan masters researched who was founded the mind-only school, and they also had different positions on this issue. And so I think that we will take a 30-minute intermission now.
Dage chubra mege mandoya rase sabe yena namresa dena jamde